Activation 1, Triumvir vs. Seattle. Triumvir goes first. Orders are silent running. Triumvir and Aldrin both advance on silent running. Box of scraps is placed on one Aldrin. Seattle activation. Standard orders, Seattle's advance, staying in high orbit. Second activation is San Francisco versus Munifex. San Fran group goes first. Orders are max thrust, and both San Fran max thrust dropping to low orbit next to the debris field. Munifex activation. The Munifex and strike cruisers go on standard orders, dropping to low orbit. Third activation. Lysander versus Phalanx. Phalanx group goes first. Battle group orders are max thrust. The Phalanx moves forward on max thrust, staying in high orbit. Galileo scoots forward in high orbit and active scans San Fran, applying major spike and telescope token. For the Lysander activation, battle group orders are max thrust. Lysander advance in a spread formation. Santiago come on left flank on standard orders. Both drop to low orbit. Fourth activation, Pungari Thresher versus Gun Cruisers. Pungari Thresher battle group goes first. Battle group orders are max thrust. Thresher goes max thrust, dropping to low orbit. Kievs go standard orders and stay in high orbit. Railgun Cruiser activation, no battle group orders. Gun cruisers drop to low orbit on standard orders. Galileo active scans Thresher, applying major spike and telescope token. Fifth activation is Savannah versus Drop Cruisers. Drop Cruisers go first. Battle group orders is max thrust. The bulk landers max thrust, dropping to low orbit. Seneca then advance on standard orders into low orbit. For Havana activation, there are no battle group special orders. Havana advance on standard orders, staying in high orbit. Sixth activation, Beijing versus Belarus. Beijing battle group will activate first. Battle group order is max thrust. Beijing advances on max thrust, staying in high orbit. Vienna also advance on max thrust, staying in high orbit. Due to the traffic jam developing behind the only cover, these ships are actually positioned near the San Fran, and there's a token on the field you can't see representing that. Next we have the Belarus activation. Battle group is doing standard orders. Strike cruisers advance and drop to low orbit. Belarus advance and stay in high orbit. Moving on to the roundup phase. There is no ground combat or space station firing. For bomber phase, the Belarus launched 6 bombers onto the nearest Havana. The Seattle launched 6 fighters to the Havana on response. For the torpedo phase, the Havana split their 4 torpedoes between 2 separate Belarus. All ships that have launched receive their spikes. There are no drop assets deployed this phase, and it's on to round 2. During the planning phase, the UCM played Dissipate Energy to remove a major spike from the San Francisco. And it's on to the first flip, the Munifex versus the Lysander. The Munifex lead off, going on standard orders. The strike carriers advance on standard orders, dropping into the near-middle cluster. The Munifex then advance on standard orders, also dropping into atmosphere. For the Lysander activation, battle group order will be course change. The Santiago will course change into a right angle, staying in low orbit. Lysander drop into atmosphere on the 2 corner clusters. The middle Lysander courageously stays in low orbit and advances to the opposing station. Second activation is Triumvir versus Havana. Triumvir leads. Both groups advance on standard orders, with the Aldrins dropping to low orbit and the Triumvir staying in high orbit. Triumvir drops a box of scraps on one of the threatened Baleares. Havana activation. Battlegroup orders are active scan. 1 Havana scans the non-box of scraps Aldrin. Bombers on the threatened Havana manage to deal 5 damage, causing crippling. Ship is destroyed, with a radiation burst causing 2 damage to the neighboring Havana. Third activation, Bulk Landers versus Seattle. Bulk Landers go first. Battlegroup goes under standard orders. Bulk Landers advance. No targets are within range due to debris field and lack of spike on Havanas. Seneca then advance and stay in low orbit. Seattle activation. Seattles go under standard orders. Both cruisers go into low orbit and target the spiked Aldrin. The ship is destroyed, and it spikes its neighbor with a blazing wreck. Fourth activation, Baleares versus San Fran. San Fran goes first. Group special orders is station keeping. 1 San Fran stays behind debris field, and the other advances toward the middle cluster. Lead San Fran targets the Aldrin. No damage with its wing cannons. Baleares activation, standard orders. Strike carriers descend into atmosphere at the near cluster. Baleares stay in high orbit and advance to near Havana. Torpedoes destroy both targeted Baleares. 1 resurrects due to box of scraps with 2 health. Fifth activation is Phalanx versus Pungari. Phalanx goes first. Battlegroup orders are weapons free. Galileo advances, doing active scan and spiking the Beijing, placing a major spike and telescope token. Phalanx advances through debris field on weapons free. It takes 2 damage from going through the field. Phalanx targets the Beijing. Beijing takes 10 damage, crippled with fire. Pungari activation. Battlegroup orders are active scan. Thresher performs active scan, first moving straight forward. It then places a minor spike on the nearest Bulklander cruiser, followed by targeting both the Phalanx and the nearest Aldrin. Phalanx takes 1 damage with Corruptor token, and Aldrin takes 2 damage with 1 Corruptor token. For the Kiev activation, they advance in standard orders, dropping a layer to low orbit. The Kiev target the spiked bulk lander, dealing 5 damage, causing a cripple and a fire. Activation 6, Beijing versus gun cruisers. Beijing group goes first. Battlegroup orders are course change. Beijing takes a course change around the debris field. It puts its close action into the Baleares across orbital layers, and its main guns into the bulk lander that's wounded. Baleares is destroyed. Bulk lander is destroyed. Explosion doing 1 damage to its neighbor. Vienna course change around the debris field. The Vienna target the remaining Aldrin. It is destroyed, but returns with box of scraps and 2 health. For the railgun cruiser activation, battlegroup orders are weapons free. Galileo first moves. It performs active scan, spiking the Thresher and placing a telescope token, though it already had one, so that's probably a mistake. For the railgun cruiser activation, they go weapons free and advance straight. They target the Pungari Thresher, dealing 13 damage, crippled, with armor cracked. And that brings us to the roundup phase. For this round, there is no ground combat or station firing yet. For bombers, the Pungari launch their 4 bombers on one of the railgun cruisers. The Seattle drops 6 bombers onto the Phalanx. In response, the Triumvir places 6 fighters on the Phalanx. And the Bellaris place 2 fighters on the threatened railgun cruiser. The Havana placed 3 light torpedoes on the threatened railgun cruiser. Then we get to drop assets. All troop ships and strike carriers that are eligible drop, giving us this initial ground map for round 2. During the damage control phase, the UCM play expert repair crews onto the Beijing, which is espionaged. Then the espionage is espionaged, repairing the fire and restoring 2 hull to the Beijing. Both the Phalanx and the Aldrin take 1 damage from the Corruptor tokens, which are repaired. And with that, we're on to round 3. First activation is Phalanx versus Pungari. Pungari battlegroup leads. Battlegroup orders are weapons free. The Kiev advance, but only one can weapons free, as the other needs to turn to keep the railgun cruisers in line. Both Kiev fire on the non-threatened railgun cruiser, managing to deal only 1 damage. The Pungari Thresher then advances. The Thresher targets the Aldrin and successfully destroys it. For the Phalanx activation, battlegroup orders are weapons free. Galileo advances. It then active scans one of the San Franciscos. The Phalanx moves straight ahead on weapons free. It targets the just spiked San Francisco and easily destroys it. The Resistance fighters successfully block all bomber damage to the Phalanx. Second activation is Railgun Cruisers versus the Beijing. Railgun Cruisers will go first. Battlegroup orders are weapons free. The Galileo leads off by pinging the non-weapons free Kiev. Railgun Cruisers then advance, each targeting 1 Kiev. Both Kiev are destroyed, with the explosion dealing 1 damage to Pungari, destroying it, and 1 damage to the Santiago. The neighboring Vienna is uninjured. In reply, the torpedoes land in the Far cruiser and destroy it. For the Beijing battlegroup orders are course change. The Vienna lead by going around the debris field and targeting the remaining railgun cruiser. They deal 6 damage with cripple and fire. The Beijing performs a course change around the other side of the debris field. It targets its close action onto the wounded Bellaris across orbital layers, and the main guns onto the remaining railgun cruiser. The Bellaris receives 2 damage, and the railgun cruiser is destroyed. Third activation, Havana versus Triumvir. Havana lead. The Havana advance on standard orders. They target the bulk lander. do 6 damage with Cripple and Fire. The Triumvir activation, Battlegroup orders are standard. The Triumvir advances. It places a box of scraps on the Bulklander cruiser. 4th activation, San Fran versus Bulklanders. Bulklanders lead. Battlegroup orders are standard orders. They move forward and target the 3 hull Havana. No hits. Seneca advance forward on standard orders and drop into atmosphere. San Francisco activation, Battlegroup orders are course change. The San Fran course changes. San Fran targets the Munifex in atmosphere. No hits. 5th activation, Lysander versus Munifex. Lysander Battlegroup leads. Battlegroup orders are course change. The Lysander in the mid dives for the right near cluster into atmosphere. The remaining 2 Lysander shuffle in orbit. The Santiago course change, continue into atmosphere. Santiago's target the Seneca. 1 Seneca is destroyed. Munifex activation, strike carriers shuffle in orbit. In atmosphere, the strike carriers target the Lysander. Lysander is destroyed. Munifex move into low orbit. They target 1 Havana. The Havana is destroyed. Final activation, Seattle versus Bellaris. Seattle lead. Battlegroup orders are course change. The Seattle course change into close action range of the Phalanx. They target the Phalanx, dealing 9 total damage with a cripple and Sprite Flash only. For the Bellaris activation, standard orders. The Bellaris stay in high orbit. They advance toward the middle. The remaining strike carriers shuffle in orbit. They take pot shots at the Lysander, which miss. And that brings us to the roundup phase of round 3. Starting off with station and ground battery fire. Both stations target the Phalanx. It is destroyed in a radiation burst that damages both Seattle. In response, the Remnant play Inherited Rank to promote their backup admiral on the Triumvir. The ground battery in the near-mid cluster targets 1 Seattle, dealing a single damage. Moving on to ground combat. In the left cluster, the Remnant lose 1 infantry. In the right cluster, the UCM lose 1 armor. Moving on to launch, the Triumvir places 3 bombers on each Havana. The Bellaris place 2 bombers on a Seattle. The UCM play atmospheric bombers. They place 3 bombers on 1 Seneca and 3 fighters on 1 Havana. As these are all within single thrust range, they resolve immediately. The Seneca is destroyed. 1 Havana takes 2 damage. The other Havana manages to avoid damage thanks to the fighter coverage. Moving on to the drop phase. On the left cluster, the Remnant place 6 infantry and the UCM 1 armor, though the armor is shot down by the defense battery. In the left mid cluster, 6 infantry are dropped, although 3 are shot down by the defense battery. On the right mid cluster, the Remnant drop 3 armor. On the right cluster, the Remnant drop 2 armor and the UCM 1. All ships get their launch spikes. During damage control, the Remnant managed to repair the fire on the bulk lander, which takes 1 damage. And that brings us to round 4. First activation is Havana versus the former Phalanx battle group. Havana go first. Havana battle group orders are course change. The group turns toward the Munifex, and each target a separate ship. Both Munifex are destroyed. The Galileo scoots forward. The Galileo active scans the Beijing to place a telescope token. Second activation, Munifex versus Beijing. Munifex go first. Battlegroup orders are course change. The Munifex turn behind the Beijing. The group targets the Beijing. They barely destroy the battleship, whose explosion does 1 damage to the nearest Munifex. Battlegroup orders for the Beijing group is course change. The Vienna course change toward the bulk lander. The Vienna target the bulk lander, which is destroyed, but immediately brought back by the box of scraps with 2 hull. Third activation is the railgun cruiser Galileo versus Lysander. Galileo scoots up, and active scans the wounded Seattle, placing telescope token. For the Lysander battle group, orders are station keeping. The 2 Lysander and atmosphere shuffle. The Corvette pair perform station keeping and target the last Seneca, which is destroyed. Next activation is Triumvir versus San Fran. Triumvir goes first. Battlegroup orders are standard orders. The Triumvir advances. It targets one of the Havana with close action weapons, dealing 1 damage and setting it on fire. The Triumvir places box of scraps on the bulk lander. For San Fran activation, orders are standard. It advances toward the Remnant space station. It targets the bulk lander with its wing guns, dealing 2 damage and consuming the box of scraps, which returns it with 2 hull. 5th activation, Bellaris versus Seattle. Bellaris go first. Group orders are course change. The Bellaris advances. The strike carriers then ascend to low orbit near the Seattle. They target the Seattle, dealing 2 damage, causing crippling, with engines disabled and orbital decay. Seattle activation, standard orders. The ship with disabled engines has to proceed in a straight line. The other one starts to try to turn around the debris field. The Seattle each target their main guns onto a separate strike carrier. The close Seattle puts its close action onto the near strike carrier. 1 strike carrier dies, and the Resistance play detonate drives. The explosion damages the Seattle and destroys the 2nd strike carrier, which plays detonate drives, which finally destroys the Seattle. At this point, realize that the other strike carriers should have moved at the same time as the Munifex. If it was compromised, they will get a chance to move and shoot now, but the Seattle will also have a chance to use its close action on them. So the strike carriers move up to low orbit. They target the remaining Seattle, causing 3 damage with cripple, engines offline, and orbital decay. The Seattle's close action targets the nearest strike carrier, but does no damage. 6th activation is the Remnant Bulk Lander. Group orders are standard orders. The Bulk Lander advances, dropping its major spike, and stays within range of the cluster. It targets the nearby Havana, and misses. And this brings us to the roundup phase. First, for station and ground battery firing, the UCM side station targets the Baleares, which is destroyed. Remnant ground batteries target the Seattle, dealing 1 damage. The Remnant side station targets 2 strike carriers, destroying 1 and dealing 2 damage to the other. The UCM ground batteries target the damaged strike carrier, destroying it and dealing 1 damage to its neighbor with the explosion. For ground combat, in the left middle cluster, UCM move all their infantry but 1 onto the enemy force. For combat, there's no damage done in the right cluster. In the middle left cluster, the Remnant lose 2 infantry to 1 UCM infantry. In the far left cluster, the Remnant lose 2 infantry for 1 armor. For launch, the Triumvir places 6 bombers onto 1 Havana, and the Seattle responds with 3 fighters. Bombers resolve immediately, and the Havana is destroyed. For drop, the Remnant drop 6 infantry onto the left cluster, UCM drop 1 armor onto the left cluster, but it is shot down by point defense. UCM plays 3 infantry onto the left mid cluster and onto the Remnant side station. The Remnant place a single armor on their side station, and the UCM place 1 armor on the far right cluster, leading to the ground game looking like this at the bottom of turn 4. Finally, for damage control, the Seattle does not repair its orbital decay and burns up in the atmosphere. Now for the first scoring turn. For the Remnant, they have ground control over 3 clusters for a total of 8 points, plus critical locations over the far left cluster and over the right mid, thanks to the remaining strike carrier, for a total of 12 points. For the UCM, they have control of both stations and the left mid cluster for 10 points, and then the San Fran is scoring critical locations on the Remnant station and left mid cluster for a total of 14 points. And with that, we're on to round 5. First activation, Havana versus Triumvir. Havana lead. Battle group orders are station keeping. The Havana holds position and targets the bulk lander. It deals 2 damage, destroying the troop ship. Triumvir activation. Triumvir turns in place. It holds position and targets the Havana. 1 damage dealt. Second activation, Phalanx versus Beijing groups. Phalanx battle group leads. Galileo scoots forward. The Galileo active scans one of the Vienna. Vienna activation. Battle group orders are course change. 3 monitors target the Triumvir. Between close action and their lasers, they deal 4 damage. Third activation is Lysander versus Railgun Cruiser groups. Lysander lead. Battle group orders are standard. Lysander shuffle in atmosphere. Santiago rise up into low orbit. They target the strike carrier and successfully destroy it. Galileo activation. It performs active scan on the San Fran, placing a telescope token. Fourth activation, San Fran versus Munifex. Munifex lead. Battlegroup orders are course change. The Munifex turn 90 degrees to try to bring themselves around. San Francisco activation. San Fran performs station keeping. San Fran turns in place. San Fran targets one of the Munifex with its wing gun and deals 1 damage. And that brings us to the roundup phase of round 5. Ground and station firing. We start with Resistance firing their ground batteries at the Santiago. One Santiago is destroyed. The UCM stations and ground batteries attempt to fire at the Triumvir through debris, doing 1 damage total. For the launch phase, the Triumvir places all 6 bombers on the center Vienna. They resolve immediately. The Vienna is destroyed. The UCM play Colonial Legions on the far right cluster. In the following ground combat, in the right cluster, the Remnant lose 2 armor and the UCM none. On the Remnant side station, the UCM lose 2 infantry, no losses for Remnant. In the left mid cluster, the UCM lose 1 infantry for no gain. For drop, the UCM place 3 infantry on the Remnant side space station in the left mid cluster, and an additional armor to the right cluster, making this the ground game at the end of round 5. Final round. First activation, Havana versus Munifex. Havana go first. Battlegroup orders are course change. Havana turns toward the Munifex. It targets one of the wounded ones and successfully destroys it. For the Munifex activation, they perform a course change toward the Vienna. They target the Vienna with a Galileo telescope token. It is destroyed with a large explosion, killing 2 of the Munifex and doing 1 damage to Triumvir. Second activation, Vienna versus Triumvir. Vienna leads. It does station keeping, places close action into the Munifex, and burn through into Triumvir. Munifex is destroyed, the Triumvir takes no damage. Triumvir activation, orders are station keeping. Triumvir stays behind cover and targets the Vienna. No damage. Third activation, Galileo versus San Fran. San Fran leads, with orders being course change. It moves out of single thrust bomber range of the Triumvir. Galileo activation, it scoots forward and drops its major spike. Fourth activation, Lysander versus Galileo. The Lysander scoot in atmosphere. The Santiago dives into atmosphere. Galileo activation, it moves forward, dropping its major spike. Here we can also add the box of scraps that the Triumvir added to itself on its turn. And now on to the final roundup phase. First, for station and ground battery shooting, all the UCM stations and ground batteries again target the Triumvir. 2 damage dealt. The Remnant ground batteries target the San Fran, dealing 1 damage. For launch, the Triumvir puts all 6 bombers onto the Havana. These immediately resolve, and the Havana is destroyed. For ground combat, in the right cluster, both sides lose 1 armor. On the Remnant Station, UCM lose 1 armor. On the left mid-cluster, the Remnant lose the last infantry. For drop, the UCM place an additional armor on the right and left clusters. They also place an additional 6 infantry on the Remnant side station. That gives us the final ground game. For scoring, the Remnant control 2 clusters, including a bonus for having the comm relay on turn 6, giving a total of 11 points, plus 2 points for having the left cluster critical location, so 13 points for the round and a total of 25 for the game. On the UCM side, they control 2 clusters and 2 stations, including the comm relay bonus, giving 17 points. They have an additional 2 points for the critical location of the Remnant side station, leaving them with 19 points for the round and 33 for the game. Final score is 33-25. This city belongs to the colonies.